Normally you recover, it's a virus, but in my case, I had a Murphy's Law set of complications that ultimately brought me to a point where there was concern about organ failure, and my family was brought in. Like, literally, I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico in a hospital at this point, and my family was brought in from the East Coast, and the doctors thought there was a good chance this could be it. And I remember thinking so clearly, it's true, on your potential deathbed, you don't think I'd wish I'd worked more.
Shame is the genesis of all this. I remember myself feeling, from my little T traumas as a kid, the shame that I was trying to fill that vessel with busyness and academics and accolades. And like you, I didn't carry any friends forward in my life from college or med school. There were not the connections or the relationships, and shame was the driver, fear and shame.
Emotional wealth is the piece that many of us who are driven in our work, either because we are hiding from painful points, or we're in an industry that encourages it, or unlike Becky, we never found a point of what academics call positive work engagement, where you do a good job at work and then you leave work and you disconnect.
Welcome to Catching Up to Fi, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Becky, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your hosts. We're here to help you with your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting from.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to Fi together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to Fi. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Becky Heptig, and we have a really exciting guest for you today. We talk a lot about money, but what do we talk about our why and the background to money? It's such a small part of our financial lives, but today we're talking to Manisha Thakor, who takes us down a path of MoneyZen. Becky, you excited for this talk?
I am. I really enjoyed reading Manisha's book, and I think it applies to everyone because the American culture has driven us crazy with being so focused on work and things that just are completely outside sometimes of the things we really need to be focusing on. So she brings us back to the things that we really should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think her book is in a niche that we don't talk about. I mean, this is something that, as you said, applies to everybody because we get caught up in productivity as our primary goal. And we don't get back to, who we are, why we are, and what are our goals with regards to happiness. So let's dive in and introduce Manisha, okay?
All right.
Manisha has worked in the male-dominated field of the financial services industry for more than 30 years, with an emphasis on women's economic empowerment. A nationally recognized thought leader in this space, Manisha has been featured in a wide range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, NPR, PBS, CNN, all the important ones. Prior to co-authoring MoneyZen, which came out in 2023, Thakor co-authored 2 finance books for women in their 20s and 30s. That was a bit of a different focus than this one. It was more, as we'll talk about, on money problems and not money worries, and we'll define that. On My Own 2 Feet was one of them. A Modern Girl's Guide to Personal Finance and Get Financially Naked was the other one. How to Talk Money with Your Honey. Today, her work focuses on helping women of all ages balance financial health and emotional wealth. I find her work is equally applicable to men and thoroughly enjoyed MoneyZen. Thakor earned her MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA from Wellesley College. She splits her time between Portland and rural Maine, although because of MoneyZen, she's now moving to Washington, D.C. to be closer to her family. Her website is moneyzen.com. I met Manisha through a relationship with Aaron Keene, the host of Money 02, the podcast with Aaron. I have thoroughly enjoyed interacting with Manisha. She is a warm, generous, and transparent human being recovered from being a human doing. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Manisha to Catching Up to Fi. How are you doing today, Manisha?
I'm so excited to talk to Bill and Becky today.
Well, we're excited too. I just really loved your book, Manisha, and I am going to share it with a few people in my life that have some workaholic tendencies. So, and I think all of us probably that are listening to this, either we are a workaholic or we know someone closely that is a workaholic.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
it's like this permeates everyone. It doesn't matter what your status, your age, nothing. It applies to everyone. So I'm excited about this.
Well, I'm a recovering workaholic, so this absolutely applies to me. I've made some inroads with this, but having read Manisha's book, I've got a lot more work to do, as I know it. So, Manisha, you start, what is the cult of a never enough? There are two paths to becoming part of a cult: the conscious decision and a series of small, consistent, unconscious steps toward the flickering flame. Can you describe for us your term, the cult of never enough?
To me, the cult has almost a mantra, and it goes like this: no matter how much money I make, no matter how many accomplishments I achieve, no matter how many accolades I receive, it's never enough. And I feel I'm never enough.
All right. Well, if that's the cult, you talk also about self-worth and net worth. We focus on the money, and this book is not about money. Tell us about your concept of self-worth being linked to net worth.
What happened in my particular case was that I developed, as many of us do, a very unhealthy framework by which I was optimizing my entire life. I literally, up into my late 40s, believed that my value as a human being on this planet was reflected in a number, one number, my net worth. And when I unravel that, it wasn't because of stuff. I mean, I drive a 12-year-old Mini Cooper. The outfit I'm wearing right now is entirely purchased off Poshmark, which is a clothing resale website. Like, I'm not fancy. So it wasn't about trying to get rich and famous in that kind of context that led me to believe my self-worth was my net worth. It was experiences that happened when I was young, what I call small T traumas. From 4th through 6th grade, I was very chubby. I had a skin condition called psoriasis. I was mixed race in a small Indiana town where there were no Indians. And kids called me cowbutt and thunder thighs. And it was a very painful period. And I found solace in my academics and in compliments and praise from teachers. And then I moved into the work world. And in my case, it was into the financial services world. And in that world in particular, what replaces grades and accolades, but promotions and money. So because I had found a pathway to help deal with a difficult situation as a young person, I continued that into my adult life in a way that became incredibly toxic.
Well, you talk about making money your God as the fastest route to misery and self-absorption. And these are external drivers as opposed to internal drivers. Can you take us through why money can make us miserable?
Money is a necessary but insufficient input into a life full of satisfaction. And many of us may recall in the financial independence community, given that most of us are in the late stage of life, that there was a very famous study that came out about 15 years ago that stated if you earn anything above $75,000 a year, that's not going to make you any happier. That's the level, that's the number. And the original academics behind that study teamed up with a group from Penn. So it was a Princeton Penn study. and they revisited it. And what they came out with was new research earlier this year stating that, yep, that study was wrong. But it is not wrong for the reason people may think it's wrong. It's not wrong because the number was too low. It was wrong because there is a number for each of us that enables us to meet within the Maslow hierarchy of needs, our core needs as we define them. But earning money beyond that, in the absence of a foundation of well-being and emotional well-being, leads to a situation where incremental dollars do not lead to incremental life satisfaction. And that's the reason why, from an academic standpoint, money doesn't make us happy. From a human standpoint, the reason money doesn't make us happy is because the stuff that makes us happy is human connection and creativity and curiosity. And you don't need money for any of that stuff.
And you talk, Manisha, in the book about what was enough for people years and years ago. Our culture 100 years ago was quite a bit different than it is now. I mean, back then, people were happy if they could put food on the table and had a roof over their head. And now we don't even think about that. We think about, do I have the latest outfit? Do I have the right kind of car? I mean, can you speak to that for just a minute?
Absolutely. And doing the research around what enough meant in prior periods, the academics call it competence. So I go back to the days when I was a kiddo and I used to read the Laura Ingalls Wilder series and Little House on the Prairie. And I adored those books. And as I thought back to that, Pa in the series and Ma were demonstrating competence. They had the ability and the means through self-sufficiency to provide food, shelter, clothing, transportation. Now is at a very base level, but that is where they took their self-esteem and self-worth from, was the ability to meet those basic core needs and spend the remainder of their time, of which they didn't have a lot of free time, but in an institution, oftentimes religious institution, or in community, connecting with others. And so now this notion, like when I read that, my shoulders just dropped. I thought, oh, competence. That sounds delightful. But if you fast forward to today, like if the three of us were dropped in the woods, we wouldn't be able to last very long. We wouldn't be able to figure out how to feed ourselves and shelter ourselves and clothe ourselves if somebody dropped us in there naked. And so the very essence of how we now provide those things for us comes from this external thing called money. So there's also a very visceral fear in the modern era that we cannot have a life of competence, because the only way most of us know how to do it in modern society is through money. And because there's easier access to credit these days, and there have been over the last 50 years, it's exploded. Our definition of food, housing, shelter has also exploded. And so I think that the shift in what we consider competence, or some people might use the word success or achievement or just adulting, has changed dramatically, and not for the better.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. We've kind of gotten away from simplicity and gotten into complexity with regards to how we do this. And then we now have the concept of retirement, which really didn't exist before, and having to fund it, living until we're 90, 95, even though our working years end often in the 60s or by 70. So there's a couple of concepts you also have in your book that I think we need to unpack. And we mentioned in the intro, money worries and money problems. Take us through those concepts, because I think that's emblematic of our focus and why it's not exactly correct.
Yeah, money problems I define as situations that have an intellectual solution. For example, my credit score stinks. How do I raise it? I am drowning in student loan debt. How do I know how to prioritize paying that off versus saving for my retirement versus buying a home? I started late in life saving for retirement. What adjustments do I need to make from the typical retirement advice in order for my puzzle to enable me to have a retirement while I'm still physically able to fully enjoy it? Those problems, the answer may not be fun, but they are intellectual answers. Money worries are problems, things that weigh on us that have emotional answers. And a classic example is many women of all income streams tell me their deepest fear is ending up as the proverbial bag lady, old, poor, and under the bridge. And that is not an irrational fear, right? We women live longer. Many of our savings may go to elder care and then spousal care, so that by the time we get to our end of our lives, we very well, maybe if we haven't planned and thought through things, in that tough position. But other people, their money worry is that they will never be viewed as successful enough by a parent who maybe planted a seed in their head when they were young, or other people worry they're not going to look successful enough to their community, their neighbors, the people that they encounter in social activities. Those kinds of worries, which I boil down into a feeling of I'm not enough. However you're defining enough, that sense of I am not enough at my core is the money problem that I am most interested in addressing in this particular book.
Manisha, you talk quite a bit about workaholism and your story, what drove you to it, and what effect it had on you. I mean, it had mental and physical ramifications down the road. And I think that's a point that a lot of our audience may find themselves in, especially as late starters, is I've got to do more and I've got to do it faster. So can you just talk to us about the workaholism and how it played out in your life?
I can't tell you how many times I have been told I'm a workaholic. And I would hear it, and intellectually I would understand that it is not normal to work 7 days a week. It is not normal to get off a plane on a Thursday night at 9 p.m. after having done a bunch of meetings all day and go into the office and work till 2 a.m., go home and shower and show up at your desk before the market bell rang. I knew that, but I couldn't stop myself because it was that behavior fed me in a number of ways. Number one, being that busy made me feel important. Being that busy also filled up holes and cracks in me that if I had space, I might actually have to look at and ask myself why I felt unworthy of love, connection, being part of a broader group of friends. In my case, by the time I reached 50, I realized that I had literally destroyed virtually every friendship I had had outside of the workplace by missing weddings, births, divorces. And at the end of the day, it almost killed me, quite literally, twice. And it wasn't until the second time that I really had the wake up call. The first time I was in Laos on a motorcycle with my ex-husband. He's an off-road motorcyclist, and I was on the back, and in motorcycle parlance they call that two up. Now I'm in the jungles of Laos, but of course I'm still working. I've got my earbuds in under my helmet and I'm listening to business books. But I remembered to put my DEET on and bug spray. But very last day, we were in the capital city. And of course, I pull out my laptop. I go to a coffee house to work. I'm sweating profusely. I don't think to reapply. And I get bit by an infected mosquito. I come down with dengue fever, which they call breakbone fever because it feels like someone's crunching your bones. And normally you recover, it's a virus. But in my case, I had a Murphy's Law set of complications that ultimately brought me to a point where there was concern about organ failure. And my family was brought in, like literally. I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico in a hospital at this point, and my family was brought in from the East Coast. And the doctors thought there was a good chance this could be it. And I remember thinking so clearly, it's true, on your potential deathbed, you don't think I'd wish I'd worked more. But within 10 days, my 10th day in the hospital, I felt well enough finally that I had my assistant come in so we could map out what work, how we would catch up on everything and what work would happen while I was recuperating. And then fast forward in my 50s, I came down with Epstein-Barr, which is like mono on steroids. And again, something that normally you would recover from. But my body had concurrent inflammation levels that were insane. My SED rate, just one marker of it, was in the upper 90s, and a normal range would be 0 to 20. And my autoimmune system was literally attacking my body and shutting it down. And I was able to stay awake about 5 hours or so a day. And this went on. I took a medical leave for 3 months, but I ended up being on leave for 9 months. It took that long for my body to recuperate. And it was during that period that I realized I had achieved financial health, but I was emotionally bankrupt. And I needed to understand how I got there and how to get out. And so that's my journey with workaholism. And the one thing I would just add on to that before we started taping, Becky, you and I were chatting a little bit about how often high achievers say, I'm doing this for my family. Yet in doing that level of intense work, you lose your family. That's what happened with my husband. I destroyed our marriage because I was never there.
Well, this isn't just the problem that you had. This is a societal and a world-based problem. In Japan, there are issues. In France, there are issues. And in China, there are issues. The people literally working themselves to death. They even have a term for it in Japan called karoshi. And in France, there was even legal action in regards to institutional moral harassment from a company from causing overwork. And China has people working themselves to death in something called gulasi. It's absolutely incredible that this is a worldwide problem and phenomenon that we don't focus on.
Right.
And what's happened is across the globe, we've moved away from that element of competence as being a core center of our self-image, self-confidence, self-esteem. Work used to be work. It was what you did to achieve the bottom two layers of Maslow's hierarchy of the needs. Then it became careers. And now we're all expected to have callings. So who we are is what we do. What we do is who we are. And the simplest way that we all have observed a bajillion times is you meet someone, particularly in the US, and one of the first 3 questions is, what do you do? And then you judge that person based on their answer, and they judge you based on your answer. And it's the shift in the role that work plays in our life, and from a societal perspective, that makes it so difficult to break free from that. It's why so many people, when they do retire, feel lost. Who am I?
Now, there's a couple of terms you talk about too in your book that I liked a lot. One of them is the hungry ghost, and the other one is the busy badge. Can you explain those for us, please?
The hungry ghost is a Buddhist concept, long held. And I love that because it shows that part of this struggle we're talking about is innate human nature. And the struggle's been going on for literally centuries. But the idea is that amongst us walk hungry ghosts who have distended bellies and throats that are as thin as a needle. And no matter how much nourishment comes into them in the form of compliments, accolades, success, and even food, the throat is so narrow, it's never enough. It can never satisfy. And that concept of hungry ghosts has, in my opinion, grown exponentially as the ways in which we can experience, thanks to the connectivity of the internet, social media, media images, that we have many, many more hungry ghosts walking amongst us on the planet. I was exhibit A for the vast majority of my life. And part of that leads into the busy badge, which is a phrase that I coined to highlight this. When you ask somebody, like, how are you doing these days? What do people answer? They're like, great, I'm busy. Okay, what's great about being busy? And then sometimes you get, I'm crazy busy, or, oh my God, I am so busy. But we view that, the answer to that isn't, oh my gosh, you haven't figured out you're enough. You don't have balance in your life. Our answer to that is, or response in our head is, oh, well, you must be important. Mm-hmm. And so somehow we conflated busyness with importance. And what is importance anyway?
Well, you talk about the busy badge being, or the power of it being that it can cover up all sorts of bumps and bruises and unhealed wounds. And you suspected that other workers or workaholics got their busy badges as adolescents, much like yourself. And then shame. And shame is the genesis of all this. I remember myself feeling from my little T traumas as a kid, the shame that I was trying to fill that vessel with busyness and academics and accolades. And like you, I didn't carry any friends forward in my life from college or med school. There were not the connections or the relationships, and shame was the driver, fear and shame. Can you tell us a little about, shame in your life and has a role in all of these concepts of MoneyZen?
I felt shame starting at this young age between 4th and 6th grade, where I felt deeply excluded and devalued by my peers because I was other physically. I didn't wear the cool clothes. Other socially, I was shy and awkward. Other ethnically, and other in terms of being interested in academics. So I went forward with an imprint on my brain that I was somehow less than, other, unwanted. And busyness was a marvelous way for me to avoid the shame that I felt from viewing myself that way. And what's interesting is that I also felt deep shame throughout my adult years that something that had happened so long ago could still be driving my adult behavior. Like, what is wrong with me? It was 3 years of bullying. I'm a pretty smart person. Why couldn't I get over that? And it's not like I woke up every day and thought about what the kids did to me back in grade school, but it was so the lack of confidence in myself, in spite of all the external evidence that I was a decent human being, I couldn't see because I had buried it under busyness.
Busyness is something that, as I was reading through your book, I totally identified with the busy badge. And I don't consider myself a workaholic. When I did work, I worked until I had kids, and then I was a stay-at-home mom. When I did work, I was out of there at 5 o'clock. I did not want that job to take over my life. But as a stay-at-home mom, I found myself doing things like I would find an excuse every day to go run errands, to get out of the house and go do something. And I kept myself very, very busy. And I finally realized years later that it was because I was covering up other things. To me, it was boring to stay at home and clean the house, which needed to be done. So I found an excuse to run away from it. And I'm still that way. I still, if I have a spare minute, I'm going to fill it with something. I have not yet figured out how to just sit and be and maybe think through something deeply, or just sit outside and enjoy nature, which I live in a beautiful place. So yes, I totally identify with busy badge.
Well, and we literally, as a nation, revere what I call human doings versus human beings. And as a yoga instructor who I interviewed on this topic, I was asking her, because self-worth equals net worth is not the toxic equation for everyone. So I was trying to understand what different equations might be. She told me self-worth equals the number of students in her class. An academic told me self-worth equals the number of papers they have published in a journal and how many times those papers are cited by other people. So there are a variety of toxic ways to answer the equation self-worth equals. But what I find is that this core issue of shame and being driven by a need to feel you are enough because of something external, not something internal, affects people of such a wide range of income, professions, ethnicity, geography. I mean, you can slice it any way you want. I also asked an executive coach two of them actually, who deal with very high level C-suite type. One was corporate, one focused on entrepreneurs. And I asked them, like, what percentage of your clients do you feel are driven by things like small t traumas or these external societal influences on valuing yourself by what you do? One said at least 75%, and the other said, well, all of them. So I feel like it is much more prevalent than we discuss.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in therapy a long time trying to process these little T traumas. It's never ending. I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm there, but it's not easy. It's a lot of work to overcome these things, and their impact is far reaching. And for me, the shame in adult life that I experienced and led to anxiety. It led to perfectionism as a way to suppress all of these issues. And perfectionism is the antithesis of not enough. You know, there's something is the concept of good enough is where you're healthy. It's the golden mean. It's the balance. Perfectionism, I worry about these kids that are perfectionistic because they're the ones that are going to have mental health issues. They're the ones that are going to fall apart. They're the ones that can't tolerate making mistakes where we truly learn. It's incredible the impact that childhoods and adolescent life have. I mean, just financially, we don't get the education and put your head in the sand and it carries forward for 20 years unless you deal with it. You talk also about striving ourselves crazy in a chapter, which I love. And some of the things you talk about in this chapter are counterfeit financial culture and flawed self-worth anchors. And the story I want you to tell is the one about 4-digit handbags. And because you haven't always worn recycled clothes or driven a 12-year-old car. You got to take us back to what the traumas did to you, handbags, and the life you actually led before you woke up to MoneyZen.
My first 15 years out of business school were spent on the institutional side of financial services, where I was analyzing investments and managing portfolios for extremely large corporations, endowments, foundations. That industry happens to pay quite well, and in my opinion, way more the value that it adds to society. But in that period, I felt like I needed armor to protect myself and show that I was successful. And so, as a woman, and there's 20% of senior folks in the industry back then were women. Now maybe it's a whopping 30%. But what I noticed was that the clothing I wore when walking into a meeting changed the way people treated me. And when I walked in with a tote from a perfectly fine Macy's or department store, I was treated one way. But when I walked in with a 4-digit Chanel bag or Prada bag or Louis Vuitton bag and took my presentation materials out of it after conspicuously putting it on the table, literally people treated me differently. When I walked into the reception area, it started there. Whoever was at the front desk would treat me differently when I was wearing my fancy pants, armor, and carrying the 4-digit bags. Later in my life, I ended up, through marriage, moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And what was fascinating to me there was the language of armor changed. There, it was whether you had leather boots or ostrich cowboy boots. And so the image of, and how much turquoise jewelry did you have? And was it from the biggest designers amongst the Indian Pueblo community? And so the pieces of armor change based on where you are. But while I was in Santa Fe, I wasn't using the 4-digit bags. And so I nailed them up in my walk-in closet, and I called it my wall of shame. And I couldn't help but periodically compound out the price that I had paid for them and what they'd be worth if I had put them in the S&P 500 and just hung on to that money. And year after year, it grew more and more shameful that I had clung so tightly to that armor. And the hard thing about that armor is I wasn't making it up. People literally did treat me different based on, in that world, based on what I was carrying. And when I was in Santa Fe, that outfit got me no kudos, none. People were like, hello? We're an artistic community. So then I needed to feel the same level of protection to have expensive artistic community stuff.
Wow. So you call that the flawed self-worth anchors. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And then you have another concept that you talked about that was false financial comparisons. So can you unpack that for us?
I have a big bee in my bonnet on this one. What I have observed over the past 5 decades is it's always human nature to compare ourselves to each other. I can remember growing up, there used to be this TV show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And you'd watch it once a week, but you didn't think you were ever going to live at those were kind of separate people that lived in a different ecosphere. What has happened since then is, because of easy access to credit, we no longer compare ourselves to the Joneses next door in an accurate way. We don't know if the Joneses next door are taking a certain vacation and driving a certain car and decorating their home in a certain way because they have the cash to do it, or because it's all on credit. And then on top of that, so our comparison in the old years, when, let's just use mortgages as an example, you had to put 20% down and your predominant choice was a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, maybe a 15-year, but the banks kept the loans on their books. So they weren't going to loan you money that they didn't think you could pay back. Well, now with mortgage-backed securities, banks, they don't care. It's going to be somebody else's problem by the time people are foreclosing on their homes. So you can easily buy more home than you can afford. But it's even more insidious in the fact that it's now in our media images. And I'm not just talking about social media where we know everybody's taking 40 photos and putting up the best one on their feed, but even something as benign as a TV show. So I happen to have been watching the TV show Suits for a while. And there's a character on Suits who I adored for her pluckiness and ambition. She started off as an executive assistant. Her name was Donna. Now, the show purportedly takes place on the East Coast in a very humid city. Women listening to this will understand that that means generally you have frizz in your hair. Every morning, Donna came to work with completely silky smooth hair. So she was getting a fresh blowout every morning. Well, that's $75. She was on the computer all day, but her nails were perfect. So clearly, every 2 weeks, she was getting a mani-pedi with gel. Again, another $50 expense in a large city. Then her clothing, you could literally see through the screen the quality of the fabric. I call it wealthy people clothing. You can just see that it's beautiful, and it was exquisitely tailored. And then she'd go out with friends and have $15 cosmopolitans, and not just one, and it wasn't just one night a week. And so I decided, well, let's add up what it actually costs to live, groom, entertain like Donna, and compare that to the average salary for that position. And then I even upped it, assuming Donna was the best. And what I found was you'd need to earn 30 to 50% more to live like these images that we are seeing of normal people, whether it's a police person or a physician's assistant or an architect or a doctor or a lawyer. I mean, it's across the professional spectrum. We are not seeing accurate images. And so then we think, well, I have that job. My life doesn't look like that. Maybe it should. And then you make it look that way through debt. Or you don't make it look that way and you feel shame.
And you transition in your book to, the doing or being what you love. Yeah. And you take us through all that and concepts like struggle porn, which is a concept I really like. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Oh, I mean, we love watching the intimate details of people struggling, and probably started with reality TV shows, or it started with human nature. But now there's become something glorified and profoundly addictive, and not in a good way, of observing people on that 24/7 hamster wheel of hustle culture. And I think a big part of this is that the equation we are taught is generally subconsciously. If you do this, you will have that, and then you will be happy. So most of us never get to the point of be happy because we're stuck in the struggle porn of the doing this and the financial pain of having that when it's more than what is appropriate for the resources coming in, given our professional choices. Whereas when you flip it on the head and you decide, I'm going to be this is how I want to feel. And then that will lead me to do the things that support that feeling. And ultimately, I will have whatever the universe intends for me to have as a result of those two activities. And I have found in my own life, as I've anchored, I don't want to say happiness because that's a really high bar, but contentment and space and connection as my anchoring B points, that is leading me to do different things. And as a result, I am having different outcomes and results, some of which I never would have imagined if I had flipped it into the other direction.
And another concept you talk about in this chapter, and a word I really liked, was investmentality. You give us stories about Hamilton and what he was trying to do with measuring productivity, which our society became based on. But more interesting to me was the story about Thomas Jefferson and investmentality regards to slavery. Can you tell us where that comes from?
It is very painful to talk about this. The notion that we, not so far back in history, viewed another human being not as a human being, but literally as an input for production to generate an output that would result in profit. And the disconnect between that and just having any empathy as a human is horrifying. But slavery in that context hasn't totally gone away. I mean, there are, I'm just going to pick on Salesforce right now because I have someone near and dear in my life who experienced this. Salesforce at the beginning of this year decided it was going to lay off 10,000 people. In their minds, I think they were investment units, because the way they did this was not to tell people, okay, we are 10% through the layoffs, we're 30% through the layoffs, not letting people have a sense of where they were. So every day they went into the office terrified. And then when they did get laid off, this is how they found out. They'd wake up in the morning, get an email saying, you're no longer employed. Here's the benefits package. You have questions, there's HR. Someone very close to me found out by putting their badge up to try and get into the building early in the morning because they wanted to get in and get some work done. So they hadn't checked their email yet. It didn't work. Opened up their iPhone and found out they were out of work. The firm's viewpoint of their investmentality as a human had shifted and they were thrown out. And so this is not to equate modern work with the horrors of slavery, but rather to highlight this trend that started so horrifically to view humans as units of investment output.
Well, that's actually happened in medicine. I'm an emergency physician, and we are measured on our productivity. We are expected to see a certain number of patients per hour. We are expected to document to the nines in order to manage revenue on a level of care. Medicine's become a industry. It's unbelievable. The corporatization of medicine has changed our system entirely. It's really sad to see. You know, I'm only as good as my for the organization.
Yeah. Productivity as a measurement is toxic to the soul.
Manisha, there was a point where you started your own company, and you talk about an assistant you had named Craig, who challenged you about the difference between doing and being. Can you tell us about that?
Chris was an amazing and is an amazing human being. High school quarterback, went on to college, quarterback, set some serious records, but also a very spiritual person at the same time. And he had attended a workshop on leadership where this concept of do, have, be versus be, do, have was presented. And he encouraged me to try and flip the way I was running the business to that latter equation. I'd like to tell you I did a fantastic job of it, but I sucked. I completely face planted because despite the fact that I could see what he was saying, it was so ingrained in me. This was in my mid 30s. For the life of me, I could not act on it. And I tried. I mean, I really tried. But the forces in the entrepreneurial world were so loud about starting with the do that I didn't have the strength of character at that time to buck the trend and say, screw you. I'm going to be a B-based business. And maybe I'm going to be a smaller business, but I'm going to be a happy business and I'll have happy employees and hopefully happy customers. I couldn't find the strength, the bravery to do it. And by the way, he now has started his own firm based on be, do, have, and he is phenomenally successful and an amazing husband and father, full of joy.
Nice.
Well, that's awesome because we look at success by working towards success first and to the detriment of ourselves. And success in reality comes to you exponentially, I think, by focusing on yourself, your health, your happiness, the happiness of the people around you, the team around you. It's a big draw as opposed to pushing to be successful. You pull success towards you by your approach, really starting with yourself and self-understanding, right?
I was such a different person before I wrote this book. Oftentimes, I had work colleagues who would say to me, I can tell how stressed you are by whether or not I can see your neck. Because I'd be like, my shoulders would be up so high. And there would be times where I was so tense and stressed by work. I literally could not move my head fully side to side because I had knots in my back that were so big. My hair was falling out. I would have spontaneous nosebleeds, serious indications that something was going on. But ironically, in that world, it was almost, again, a badge of honor, a indication that I was on the right track. And since writing this book, and it's not been easy to flip my mind to be, do, have, I have made some major changes. I have a tiny little summer cabin. I mean, and we're talking rustic cabin, no potable water, no heater, air conditioning. It's envision going to summer camp. So I have a little cabin up in Maine. It's 5 feet off a lake. And I bought it as I was going through this process because my brother has a place 2 miles down the road and his kids are still young enough that they like adults. So I wanted to spend time with them. And they also happen to live in DC. And I thought, you know what? Let me move to DC so that I can spontaneously go to one of the kids' soccer games or choir concerts. And I realized that I needed to, in order to be how I wanted to be, I had to shift environments, shift how I spent my time. But I also want to acknowledge that it's not one and done. So I wrote this book. The 2 years I spent researching it were the most glorious years. I felt like I was back in college with a blank slate and learning all kinds of new things. And that was great. Then I turned in the manuscript and then the marketing began. And oh my Lord, how quickly I reverted back into my ego-driven need for accolades and praise. And I could not do enough media. And I was constantly feeling, looking at the comments people were making, judging what level of magazine I was in, judging how deeply they incorporated my book into the story. And when I realized that, because my hair started falling out again and I started getting spontaneous nosebleeds, I was like, oh my God, I'm back in that place. But as a result of having written the book, I was able to see it, know why I had gotten into that place, and be able to step into the framework that I believe can help people get out of the space.
Well, it sounds like your cabin in Maine is a little bit like Ralph Waldo Emerson on Walden Pond. You know, it's back to those you were talking about before of competence. I mean, you're walking the walk, literally. But at the same time, from a financial standpoint, you're emotionally geo-arbitraging to a higher cost of living area. We talk about financial geo-arbitrage, but you're focusing on the emotional geo-arbitrage in order to be close to your family, engaged with the connections that help you live longer, right?
Precisely. And there are trade-offs. So the place that I live in DC is, with my partner, will be about 1,200 square feet, where most of my peers from Harvard Business School are living in 10,000 square feet homes. And for me, the ability to have two homes, one really rustic and one urban with close proximity to family, was way more valuable to me than spending money on bigger, flashier things. So compared to peers who I'm hoping to reconnect with from Wellesley and Harvard Business School, my life in DC may look like I didn't do so well. And that's okay with me for the first time ever in my life, because doing well to me means being able to spend time with my parents who are in their mid 80s and a couple hour drive from DC and seeing the kiddos. So I've changed self-worth equals net worth to self-worth equals contentment, curiosity, connection.
Now let's get on to the equation you have. This book is MoneyZen, and you create an equation for what it means. And you talk about financial health plus emotional wealth equals MoneyZen. And your book really focuses on the emotional wealth. Why did you come up with this equation, and break down the components for us a little bit?
I wanted to come up with an equation that was realistic, but also could serve as, was financially realistic, but also could serve as a North Star for that well-being, that base level of well-being that is essential for financial health to be able to manifest itself as life satisfaction. And so after 30 years of being in an industry that was all about increasing your financial wealth, what I came to realize is that wealth means nothing, as I said earlier, if you are emotionally bankrupt. And so I define financial health as a comfort, having calm, clarity, and comfort with your relationship with money and the role that it plays in your life. And by that, I mean, you have identified for yourself, or with a lot of help, because most of us weren't educated on this, how to have the core elements of financial health: an emergency fund, an attitude towards debt that is healthy in terms, in my opinion, of trying to have as little of it as possible, a game plan for retirement, even if you're starting later in life, understanding the levers that you can pull, knowing how much house you can realistically afford and how much car you can realistically afford, and whether or not the kinds of things you're doing for entertainment or vacations or day-to-day hobbies, you're spending money on them in the right level of emphasis given your financial resources. And so financial health is a money problem that can be solved with technical intellectual answers. And the shift from health to wealth is really important because that health means that you've created a financial structure where money is not a stressor in your life because you've identified how much you need to sustain your life in a way that you've stripped away expenses that society may have encouraged you to put in that really don't make you happy. Emotional wealth is the piece that many of us who are driven in our work, either because we are hiding from painful points or we're in an industry that encourages it, or unlike Becky, we never found a point of what academics call positive work engagement, where you do a good job at work and then you leave work and you disconnect. And so emotional wealth encompasses all of those things. It looks different for everyone and it changes based on stages in life. Right now, I am deeply focused on connection with family, followed by trying to reconnect with friends and making new ones who I will treat very differently. Down the road, that emotional wealth may take more of the form of learning to play piano or learning a new language or volunteering in a different way than I have been up until this point. But the main point of the equation is to encourage people to think about their life as a portfolio of constrained time and, in some ways, at that point, an amount of money that you're trying to optimize. And so I think about it as asset allocation. How do you want to allocate your time and resources between financial health and emotional wealth? And just like your portfolio allocation shifts throughout your life, your allocation to these two elements shift. So I'm not saying don't pay attention to your personal finances, ignore that and just have fun all the time. I'm saying that there are two pieces and they shift in value and emphasis and need for attention at different points in time. But when I talk about publicity for the book, one thing in books that's huge is getting reviews on Amazon. And for a while, I got absolutely obsessed that I didn't have enough reviews on Amazon. And I realized that was pulling me away from emotional wealth. So I finally stopped looking. And that's a very specific minor example, but that's the kind of thing where once I had gone through the first 2/3 of MoneyZen to understand the elements that led me to feel I had never enough, I'm now in a position when I hit the bumper rails of the highway of life and realize I'm veering off in one or the other directions. The equation helps me get back to center.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get towards the solutions to this. But before we do, I love this story about the baby elephant. And can you tell us, is emblematic of what our society is doing with workaholism and the cult of never enough approach?
So purportedly, the way circus elephants are trained, there's a young baby, they come in and they have a chain around their foot and they pull and try and break free, and they can't. And after a prolonged period of time pulling against the chain is replaced by a rope that they could pull away from, but they don't try because their mindset of what is possible is locked in to what was possible when they had that chain. And that's what I believe has happened to so many of us across so many professions when it comes to work. We believe there's a level of intensity and insanity and hustle and striving yourself to death that we have to do. And you know what? Maybe in your very early days, you do need to do it because you're still learning. But after a couple decades, maybe you don't need to be doing it. And so that's the elephant story and how it relates to one part of the solution of getting out of never enough is by asking ourselves constantly, is this true? Is this accurate? Do I really have to behave this way?
Manisha, what would be what are your suggestions or your solutions? What is the secret for folks that are caught up in workaholism, busy badges, hustle culture? I mean, what do folks do to come to this place of the financial health equals emotional wealth?
So I wish I could say I'm going to give you 3 tips too. It's super simple. The way to it is through it. And that's why most nonfiction books start off with 10% of the book describes the problem and 90% of the book puts out the solution. In this book, the vast majority of the solution is understanding how you got the problem. And so the first step is, I would argue, getting a copy of MoneyZen and reading through. And I actually put together a free reflective journal that people can use. Perhaps we can link it in the show notes as they go through the book to help take notes and ask some questions of inquiry. Once you've made it through and you have a sense of how you got there, there are several different tools and techniques that you can use. One of my favorite is asking yourself, if you woke up one morning and $50 million after tax dropped on your head, but Bill called you to say he had reviewed your labs and you're going to die in exactly 5 years, what would you stop doing and what would you start doing? And I've been asking people this question for over a decade, and the broad answers are remarkably similar. People would stop worrying, many would stop working, many would stop holding grudges, many would stop holding themselves to such a high standard. People then would want to start more time with family, more time volunteering, more time traveling, more time learning a language or an instrument. But then I encourage people, don't stop at those levels. Go down and ask yourself, well, what do I need to do to make this a reality? And it's a baby step. Just take a baby step towards that. And you'll see which one of the changes becomes the most important or the one that is most doable right away, because you can't make all those changes at the same time. So that is one of the steps that I think can help you identify, once you are clear on what financial health means and what emotional wealth means, to see how you want to adjust your asset allocation. Another tool that comes from one of the experts I interviewed is, anytime you feel internally discombobulated, ask yourself in the moment, to whom or what do I need to connect in order to feel incrementally better in this moment? The answer might be an app. The answer might be a phone call with a friend. The answer might be just sitting with yourself and the latest issue of People magazine so you can see what's up with Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. So there are a lot of different answers to that. But the practice of constantly, when you're discombobulated, seeing what you need, again, is another way to be examining that portfolio. And sometimes it is financial. So one day I was feeling very discombobulated. I'm doing some fairly extensive renovations on the place in DC. And something in my gut started to feel like my scope creep had gotten a little bit out of control. And what I needed was to do more of a line item analysis of what I was proposing to change and why. And that made me feel better. So there's a range of things. And I find those to be 2 tools that anybody can use at any time to help readjust and put the time and energy into whichever of the buckets or both of the buckets, financial health and emotional wealth, that they need at that stage.
Another tool you talk about, which I love, is kind of like a Marie Kondo type tool where you talk about joy-based spending. Can you take us through your concept of joy-based spending?
Yes. And I want to give kudos to Vicki Robin, who is one of my heroes. I read Your Money or Your Life in 1992 when it first came out. And when Vicki put out the second edition in 2018, I happened to be blessed to sit on a couple panels with her and was blown away as I was able to talk to her in the context of the FIRE movement, what she thinks of it, what her original intention was with the book. So joy-based spending very much was inspired by Vicki. What I found when working with individuals is that most people hate budgets. So I needed to come up with some way to help people achieve financial health, which you can't do if you're spending more than you have coming in. So the first step is to do a joy audit where for a period of time, 1 month is ideal. I have a hunch that folks who listen to this podcast will be able to do that. For other people, it may just be a weekend. But when you're done, you don't add anything up. You just take a highlighter and you highlight anything you spent money on that didn't bring you joy. And of course, there's the usual stuff, utilities, bills. And yes, you should see if you can negotiate them. But inevitably, people find things like soccer lessons and the kids hate the coach and you hate driving them there, or meals out with a couple who love expensive wine and you don't drink, and then the bill comes and you split it and you're just seething inside because you're paying for their wine and you didn't feel good about that. So those are the things that you can extract from your life. No joy is lost, and you can redeploy that money in either financial health or emotional wealth. The second tool I find works up to an income of about $250,000. And this one is very much of a Vicki tool, which is equating your life's energy with the amount of money that comes from it. So most of us work on average 2,000 hours a year in work-related activities. And if you have an income of $60,000 a year and you divide that by 2,000 hours, you're making $30 an hour before tax. So if you see something that costs $300, now you've got a ruler. You divide it by $30 and you know you'd have to work at least 10 hours once taxes are factored in. And you can ask yourself, is this worth 10 hours of my life energy or not? And this way, no one is pointing a finger at you and saying, don't buy this, don't buy that. You get to choose, but you're choosing in a smart way. And then my last tool, because we live in such an impulse society and we do so much online shopping, is to put things in your basket and wait a week and go back and say, really, did I really need that? And if it's something that you see in a store, take a photograph and come back to it in a week. But the rapidity with which we buy stuff these days is cluttering our lives and cluttering our happiness. Generally, my grandfather told me years and years ago, my grandfather in India, buy few, but buy the best you can afford. And back then, there were no credit cards, so he meant with cash. And I spent my junior year at Oxford in the early 90s. And one of the things that I remembered was that my classmates looked impeccably dressed, even when they were wearing like rugby jerseys and jeans, because they had very few clothes, but they were well made. And often what they were wearing was a sweater they'd had for 10 years. It still looked brand new because they weren't doing disposable clothing and other things that you bring into your home the way we do. And so that's how I think about joy-based spending.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes less is more.
Oftentimes, less is more.
Mm-hmm. And if I'm hearing you correctly, I'm what I'm taking away from this is that sometimes the hardest part of this is recognizing that you've been caught up in this. Because I know with my own busy badge, it took me probably a couple of decades to understand why I was behaving the way I was, because it felt normal to me. Even though it shouldn't have felt normal, it did. And so recognizing it and then realizing that there is something else out there, there is a better way to handle this. And so, like with my case, like I said, I didn't want to be at home. I just wanted to be out doing something. I felt like I was being productive. So I realized that I need to change the way I'm scheduling my time, and again, less is more. The less I try to accomplish, the happier I was.
Well, the opposite of that is more is less. And our society, it is less. It's a weight on top of us.
Mm-hmm.
Let's end with some definitions of enough. It's individual decide it for themselves, but there's a couple folks you quote in your book that give us an idea. And one of the ones that you like to quote a lot in your book, and I love him, is Carl Richards. He defines enough. The challenge with enough is that there's no formula for it. My own definition of enough is I know it when I feel it, and I also know when I'm out of enoughness. And it has very little to do with money. Mm-hmm. That's one definition. And then I read another book too that is by John Bogle. It's titled Enough. And he goes through his concepts of enough. And it's very interesting what he has to say. He says, too, he quotes J.D. Rockefeller, and when he was asked how much is enough, he said, just a little bit more. But Jack's answer was, enough is $1 more than you need. It's not that infinite amount, just a little bit more that never ends, where the goalposts continually move. The great game of life is not about money. It's about doing your best to join the battle to build anew ourselves, our communities, our nation, and our world. Now, this is reminiscent for me of Teddy Roosevelt's famous speech, The Man in the Arena. It's the people that get bloodied and dirty in the act of battle, where you're engaged with life, you're creative, that find their enough. It's the people that are focused on the traditional American values that will never find it, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My definition of enough is something that I came up with in my early 20s. On my way back from that year at Oxford, I can so vividly remember this. I was reflecting on what I had learned, and I had read a lot of Emerson and Thoreau, and was particularly taken with Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, during that year of study. And in A Room of One's Own, which was written back in 1917, Virginia Woolf posited that in order for a woman to fully flourish in terms of her creativity and enjoyment of life, she needed some space and some money of her own. And I took that and I created a triangle where at the top I wrote the word simplicity. The bottom left-hand corner, I wrote the word small joys. And the bottom right-hand corner, I wrote financial independence. And every year after that, at the end of the year, when I was thinking about goals and values, I'd ask myself, is there anything I want to change about this? And in over 30 years, the only thing I've changed is adding curiosity to the center. I used to call it Zoom, buzzing around like a bee, being curious. But after the pandemic, Zoom didn't feel so good to put in the middle of it. But Carl Richards, who I too adore and had the pleasure of getting to work with him, made me this visual depiction of my simplicity, small joy, financial independence. And when I was on bed rest for 9 months from the Epstein-Barr hyperinflammation experience, I was on the sofa one day and I saw this and I thought, oh, good Lord, my triangle turned upside down. I was basing everything on financial independence. And as a result, I had lost all simplicity and all small joys. And when I was able to realize that, I feel like I got back into my place of enough, and to open the space, because I had enough, to be curious. And that's brought it all together for me.
Yeah, that triangle, I'm glad you brought that up because I love it. Carl Richard's depictions of a lot of concepts in life and finance are just incredible. And I recommend to our audience that you subscribe to his newsletter and get those depictions. In conclusion, in your book, you give us permission to achieve less. And it's very interesting because you say to live a rich, joyful, and connected life, achieve less. It's exactly the opposite of what Americans think. Tell us about that. And, how do we move forward?
When I first started to play with that phrase, achieve less, I kind of wanted to dry heave. It just felt so viscerally awful. Like, what do you mean achieve less? But as I went through the research and I started to realize how little we often experience when we're focused solely on striving to achieve more, we lose the joy inherent in what we're doing. In other words, when we do have B, we are not nearly as fulfilled as when we do have. Now, if you start from the place of B, almost by definition, you have to achieve less, because when you're achieving more, you end up with no space to be. Mm-hmm. And so that chapter has been probably the most controversial. And I think it's because people are so afraid to say, I'm going to achieve less. And what I've decided to do is I'm going to take the next 24 months, and I have a couple of board commitments, volunteer and corporate. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to achieve less. I'm not going to look for any other pieces of business to come into my life. And I want to see what happens to my connection with people and connection with myself and interest in life and general well-being, if I give myself true permission to achieve less, which I have never done in my life.
Well, we've talked to Jordan Grummett before, and he's big, as you are, into the art of subtraction. And there's also an art to saying no. And it's hard to do. We tend to be people pleasers, and we want to achieve because of our busy bags and wanting to have the accolades for those dopamine hits. But achieving less is kind of what I completely agree with you, actually. I've downshifted my career, actually took a pay cut, and I'm happier than I've ever been, as opposed to achieving more or achieving more money. Becky, I want to know what your definition of enough is before we end here.
Oh my gosh. You're going to put me on the spot. One of the words that I've heard a couple of times today in this interview is contentment. And I think that as Americans especially, but this may be global, that we don't even know what contentment is anymore. It's kind of like we grow up without financial education. I don't think anybody ever teaches us what contentment means. And for me, I think it's finding that. I mean, everybody knows I'm a person of faith, and my contentment is in that I know that God created me, and he created me just the way he wanted me to be. And I just need to be content with that. I need to know that he made me enough, and that I don't have to strive to create enough in my life. And it's not something I've achieved yet, for sure, but at least it's now something that is in the front of my brain rather than in the back of my brain.
I think your book helps us greatly with all of these concepts. I mean, I look at it like the simple path to wealth in many ways. I mean, this is a book to that. You know, we need to know how to do it financially, and we need to know how to do it emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And so read both. You know, read yours first, because you need these pieces before you read A Simple Path to Wealth. And we don't look at it that way. You know, it flips everything on its. So I want to thank you for your book. I want to thank you for your time today. It's been illuminating. I want everybody to write a review of your book just based on this podcast. So
That's right.
You cannot look at them. Everybody else too. I'm hoping that we can have a little book giveaway to folks in our community so that they too get to book and be motivated to do so. Manisha, thank you so much for here. I can't tell you enough what your book meant to me.
Bill and Becky, thank you so much for having me and letting me share these thoughts with the FI community. And here's to collective contentment.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
All right. We hope to talk to you again soon. Take care and have a happy holidays.
Thanks.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to 5. We would appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star review so that our message can reach others.
We are not lawyers, financial advisors, accountants, or tax experts. Please consult your own professional advisors before making any important decisions. Our content is for entertainment and education purposes only.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to 5.